All right. So I'm going to be putting a bit more meat on the bones that Jonas and Mark already scratched the surface of on the bones. That metaphor didn't work very well. So I'm going to be talking about internationalization features in Control Center and Copilot. So internationalization and localization, or as the cool kids call it, I18N and L10N. Let's define those terms before we start, because there's a distinction that I keep forgetting. So internationalization is basically the act of implementing a UI in a way that it can support multiple languages instead of having to just have, I don't know, like multiple hard-coded versions of each UI file for each language. And so that's mainly about fetching text for the UI from files or database or something. And it could also be, for example, ensuring that the UI supports right-to-left mode, like in Hebrew or Arabic, which, by the way, all the Vaadin components do out of the box. Localization, on the other hand, is about actually doing those translations, about providing those texts for different languages. And it's also about things like changing the number formatting, date formatting, and so on to match the locale of that language. Can also be like iconography and whatever. But today we're going to be focusing on those texts in the UI. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a big fan of actually internationalizing the UI code that I'm writing. It tends to be kind of a pain in the ass because I'm writing my code, I'm writing my UI code, and I'm writing more code, and then I'm adding a button. And then I need to add a text to the button. It's a save button, so I write save. And then I remember that, oh yeah, this needs to support a gazillion different languages. So that's not going to work. So instead, I need to call the translation API. And of course, I need to provide it with some kind of identifier for the text that it's going to fetch. So I need to come up with a translation key. And it's a save button, so let's go with, I don't know, button.save or something, whatever schema you're using for your translation keys. And of course, if you are using a specific schema, which is usually a good idea, you also need to figure out, well, what is a schema again? Like, how do we name these things? And that's not enough. You also need to open a totally different file, the translation file, and add your translation there and the key. And then if you already had translation files for a bunch of other languages, then should you also at this point add the key there? And do you need to provide the translations now? Like, how do you do that? And then once you're done with all of that, you close those other editors, you go back to your UI code file, and you kind of forgot what you were doing because now you were kind of taken out of your flow, your zone, your workflow basically. So that's where we get into the internationalization automation features in Copilot. And by the way, I should mention that my system seems to be a bit glitchy right now. Apparently, you're supposed to restart your computer once a year or something. But I'm not a big believer of that, so I haven't. So you probably will see the first demo effects of the day in this presentation. So let's open Copilot while it's already open. We have the internationalization panel here. God, I hate saying that. And when you highlight one of these elements here, it will show you that this component here, this street address field, contains a bunch of static strings. Let's have a look at the code quickly. Yep, here we have static strings, street address, street name, house number, postal code, city. This entire form is completely uninternationalized. It's full of static strings. We do have a translation property file. Oops, that I forgot to change. We do have a translation property file here. And it contains the names of the views. And we even have that for Finnish as well. And we use them in our main layout here, where we create the navigation column. We have these calls to translate method passing those keys. And that is why when we look at this UI here, we'll see that these are actually translated into Finnish. I have this locale switcher here. So English, Finnish is translated, but only the view names. Swedish isn't translated at all, and so on. So let's open Copilot and detach that internationalization panel. So when we click this, when we select an element with Copilot, the internationalization panel will show you all of the static strings in that component. So for the street address field, we have the label and we have the helper text. And what it does is that it generates automatically translation key proposals for you. So for example, we have Vaadin text field dot street address -1 dot label. It's not very pretty, but it's a key, and it will probably give you a pretty good idea of what that key is for. And it does the same thing here for the helper text, same key except for dot helper text at the end. So what we can do here is we can click apply, and it will think for a bit, and then when we look at the code, it will have replaced those static strings with calls to the translate method, and it will have passed those translation keys that it generated to the method. And when we go have a look in the translation properties file, you'll see that those same keys and the corresponding default language values have been populated into the translation property file. Only the default file, though, the one that's typically called translations.properties, not the other languages. Okay, so that was for one component, but you can also click this find all static strings method here. And that will now show you a list of all of the components that are currently visible in the viewport. That both ones that do contain oh, sorry, I actually should switch to English before I do that. Let's do that. Okay. So let's try that again. Please, Copilot, open. Okay. Find all static strings. So it now lists all of the static strings as well as some of the already internationalized ones in the panel here. It lists the internationalized ones because you can actually go in and edit the internationalizations of those strings afterwards, but we're not doing that now, so we can just toggle that off. So here we see, and we can, for example, click on any one of these. We can click on the Save button here, and it will expand that item in the panel. And if you don't want to use this default translation key that it has generated for you, you can rename it to, well, we were going to use button.save, so let's go with button.save. We can do the same thing with the cancel button, button.cancel, and then we click, and we can leave all of the other ones as is. We can uncheck ones that we don't want to internationalize, that we want to keep static for some reason. But let's just click apply, and it thinks for a bit, it processes for a bit, and then it says that it has now completed internationalization. There's 10 properties in 8 elements, and 10 new translation keys have been added. So if we go now to the file here, we see that it has replaced all of these static strings in the UI components with calls to the translation API with those keys that were generated, and also the button.save and button.cancel which I edited manually. And of course, all of those have also been populated into the translation property file. So the point of this feature is that instead of having to, every time that you, or while you are building the UI, instead of having to do the internationalization while you are doing that and getting kind of yanked out of your flow, you can just implement your UI code as if you didn't care about the internationalization, and then afterwards go through it with Copilot and internationalize all the things. So that was Copilot. And by the way, this has nothing to do with AI. This is just a purely mechanical conversion that happens. It doesn't use LLMs or anything like that. So then localization also kind of sucks. So we have the default language that could be English, and then we have one for German, and then we have one for Finnish and one for Swedish. And when you're localizing, that is translating the UI, you just need to kind of work with all of these files in parallel, making sure that they all have a line for each translation key and an appropriate translation and so on. And let's say if the developers are not doing the translations themselves, as maybe they shouldn't, let's say if they actually have a professional translator doing that, professional translators usually don't want to work with property files because, well, they probably don't have the code in front of them at all. And even if they do, juggling these different files is just awkward. So I know what a lot of companies do is that they copy the contents of these files into a spreadsheet, and then the translators work there, because then at least you can keep track of which translations are present and which are not. And then, of course, you have to copy the edits back into your property files, which is kind of an awkward workflow. There are applications out there. There are tools for example, working with property files. There are tools even more specialized for doing localization. But there are still things that are awkward in this process. For one thing, translation often happens in kind of a blind mode, blind translation, meaning that you don't see where the string that you're translating is used in the UI, which can be a bit problematic. So let's say that we have here the key state and the English text state. We need to translate it into German. Well, how do you translate state into German? Well, we could assume that we're talking about German states, states in the German Federation. That would be Bundesland. But what if we're not talking about Germany here? What if we're talking about the United States? Then it would be Bundesstaat, right? And don't correct me if my German is wrong. Let's just go with it. Let's pretend that my German is awesome. But okay, what if it's neither of those? Because state can mean a lot of different things. What if it's actually more like a state of being? Like, for example, I woke up in a terrible state this morning. And I don't mean Hesse. What I mean is I had too much Schweinhexe yesterday. And so then we're talking about a totally different type of state, which would be, I guess, Zustand. So without knowing the context of where that string is used in the UI, it's really difficult to know how to translate it properly. And if you're just working with a property file or with a spreadsheet, unless the translation key gives you enough context, you really don't know how you should translate it. Another problem with blind translation is that you don't see how the translation will actually fit into the UI. So here's the text in Finnish. Here's the same text in Swedish. Here's the text in English. It's a bit longer, so it doesn't fit on one line, but luckily there's wrapping, and the UI can accommodate that. So it just wraps onto 2 lines and everything is fine. And maybe the German speakers in the room can already see where I'm going with this, because now we broke the UI. And the translator has no idea. Even the developer, if the developer is doing the translations in the property file, unless he checks every single thing he does, he probably won't notice that this won't work. So localization sucks in a number of ways. The translation files are difficult and error-prone to manage. Translators don't want to work with them. Translating words without knowing how they're used in the UI is also error-prone. And these blind translations can even break your layouts. So that brings us to localization management in Control Center. Before we go to Control Center, though, I want to show you one last thing that Copilot has, which is this localization data panel here. It tells you how many strings are in the translation property file and so on, and it shows you 14 screenshots of internationalized elements. Now, screenshots? Well, actually, it explains it right here below. So for every component that Copilot internationalizes, it takes a screenshot of that component, stores it in the browser's local storage, and then you can click this download zip button here to download a zip with which I could actually just show you so that we don't have to do everything again. It's a zip file that contains, it's a bit too small for you to see, but maybe you can see the default translation properties here, the Finnish translation file, and then a screenshot of the cancel button, the save button, the address, and all of those things that we translated or internationalized. And these screenshots are named according to the translation key that was given to them in Copilot. So what we can do then is we can go to Control Center and we can deploy that application. Oh, now it's probably timed out, so I need to log in again. Okay, there we go. Right. So we click deploy. We say Office Manager. We provide the image, the Docker image of the application that I already built. And we provide it with a URL to run it on, and then we click deploy. And it takes a while for it to become available. Hopefully not too long. Now it's available. And now we can select Office Manager here, and we can go to localization. And we can enable localization. As you can see, localization requires the premium subscription. I have that because I work at Vaadin. And we get into this view where you go to upload translations. And here, you can upload the translation data, meaning your translation property files. You can upload, if you're not using the Copilot thingy here, that I showed you, you can just upload translation property files one by one, or like select all of them, and they will be uploaded. But since we are using Copilot, we can select this zipped translation data package, and we can, sorry, what? Oh, okay, that was one of the glitches I told you would happen. zipped translation data package, upload file, and we will upload that zip file that we got from Copilot that contains the property files and the screenshots of the translated or internationalized components. We check a checkbox, and we also need to provide it with the default. Okay. Yeah, this is not Control Center. This is my computer being a bit weird right now. Please behave. We click Replace Data. And OK. Now we see something that kind of resembles that spreadsheet that we had for the where we had copied the translation property files, except Control Center kind of takes care of that for you. And when you click something like the Save button here, or the Save string, you'll see that the screenshot that Copilot took is actually available here. So you can see where in the UI that string is used. And as you can see, it highlights that component with a dotted red outline, so you can see which component it is. So, glitch. There's something wrong, I think, with my my Kubernetes cluster. I'm not really a Kubernetes guy, so I'm not sure what to do about it, and I didn't want to start tinkering with it just before my talk. So let's just ignore that. But what we can do here is we can start translating, and I'm going to translate live now, which is great. Cancel is kumoa, save is tallenna, address is osoite, country is maa, federal, state, if applicable, osavaltio, jos tarpeen. I'm not sure how to translate that to Finnish. Osavaltio, kaupunki, postitoimipaikka, something. This is really entertaining to watch. Postinumero. Okay, let's just leave it at that. That's too long. So now we have edited the translations here. And the next thing we can do is, if this thing could stop glitching for me. Okay, so we can start a preview, a localization preview. And what this does is that it actually starts a new instance of the application that is already deployed to our Kubernetes cluster. But this instance is configured to not read its translations from the property files that it was deployed with, but read them directly from Control Center. So if we open the preview now, and yes, it's going to steal my credit card information. Okay. So what we can do here now is switch to Finnish and go to that view that we had actually translated. And you can see now that instead of just having the view names translated to Finnish, we have the address and all of these input fields except the one that I didn't bother translating. So this means that we can actually preview the translations that we are doing in the deployed application without having to redeploy the application and check that everything works. Then we can go back here, and if you remember, we also had Swedish as one of the options in the application. So what we can do is we can add language and pick Swedish, Swedish, and add it. And then we'll also make sure that we can see it in the spreadsheet or the editor here. And as you can see, there's this indicator here showing you how far each language has been translated. So Swedish has 0 translations, so it's an empty diagram. And we can also see the full progress of the translation here. So we have 26 translations in total in all of these languages done, and 16 are missing. So again, I can start live translating here. And I can write avbryt, spara, anställda, adress, nyanställd, kontorsadress, land, and so on and so on. And we should now be able to go to the, yes, that's a preview one, yes. We can go to the preview deployment again, and we can switch to Swedish. And it's glitching a little bit again. Oh, maybe I need to actually stop the preview because we added a language. Start the preview again. And reopen. Oh, it takes a bit for it to start up. Even though it says running, it's not really running until after a while. There we go. Now it hopefully should work. Yes. So I didn't translate any of the fields except for country. And, oops, except for country. And please zoom out. So my whole computer is a bit like frozen these days. I should probably restart it after this talk. But you can see here that we have the address title here, and the save and cancel buttons have been translated now. So we can add basically new translations in Control Center in a deployed application. We can preview them without having to do any kind of redeployment or anything like that. We just need to start that preview instance, reload it, and see the new translations. And basically, when you're done with this, you can then download the, yes, I'm online, thank you. You can download the translations, and that will give you another zip with the translation files, which, let's see, it's over here. And well, then you get a zip with the translation files, and you can take those translation files and copy them back into your actual code base and store them in your Git repo. So that was the deal with internationalization and localization in Copilot and Control Center. That whole thing with uploading the translation files first from Copilot and then downloading them back into your repo, that's the method that you need to use right now. In the long term, we intend to streamline this by, for example, allowing Control Center to fetch the existing translations directly from the deployed application so that you don't have to upload anything, and also probably adding some kind of, let's say, GitHub integration or something so that you can just fetch your translations directly from Control Center to your code base, to your version control, instead of having to first do it locally. But that is the state today. And that's basically it. Do we have any questions? Yes? Oh, we have a mic here.
Hi. Just one question. How do you handle like a placeholder in the UI? So if you have you have this quite often, and then you have to render it with maybe some variable content or some other fields, right?
That is another feature that is currently technically missing. Of course, you can enter placeholders into your translation string, but it's all manual work. You need to just make sure that you write your translation string containing those placeholders. So that's something that we intend to add to Control Center, some kind of more user-friendly management of those placeholders and other formatting you might have. Because the intent is that instead of just developers doing the translations, you could, for example, give access to this Control Center for a third party, like a translation consultancy. And you could give them user accounts there that would be limited to only working on the translations. So then they can go in straight to Control Center and manage them there. And professional translators may not know how to deal with those placeholders and so on. So the idea is that we will provide some kind of nice editor for them to handle those.
Yeah, this will also affect maybe some formats like dates and other stuff, where you can maybe mark this as country special and then.
Yes, exactly.
You cannot capture everything from the language or from the region automatically just through a browser, right?
Yeah. So once we, for example, have these translator users set up in Control Center, once we have that feature, the idea is that as soon as somebody, like a developer, uploads a new set of translation files that have missing translations in a particular language, any translator user who is configured in Control Center to be responsible for that language will automatically get an email notification saying that, hey, we have 16 missing translations for German, for example. And then they can just log in, do the thing, and once they're done, depending on how at that point the translations are then copied back to your version control, either the developer just gets a notification that, hey, new translations available, or maybe they can just click a button and that happens automatically somehow. Another thing that is currently missing, but will probably be one of the first additional features that we will add, are some kind of review mechanism. So quite often in translation processes, you have a whole bunch of different people translating into various languages, but you still need to have someone who checks the translations to make sure that they are okay and approves them before they are actually taken into use. So that's another feature that is still missing, but we intend to add.
Okay.
Thanks. Is this available right now, or?
It is available right now. As mentioned, the localization feature in Control Center requires a premium subscription, but other than that, it is already part of Control Center.
But the Copilot buttons to export languages, this is available right now?
Yes, the Copilot features are already in Copilot, yes.
How do you handle diacritic letters if it is translated to code points?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What about diacritic letters? If it is translated to code points, or do you use it in properties files?
Yes, I think that was actually, was that fixed already? Yeah, so there's currently, or I think it's been fixed actually, yeah. The translation property files are in UTF-8 format, should be in UTF-8 format, and we previously had an issue where that wasn't supported actually. We only supported ASCII or whatever. But now it should be fixed, so anything that is in UTF-8, you should be able to just write normally. So shouldn't be an issue. Well, they're stored in UTF-8. It's a Unicode file, so yeah.
Any other questions?
There's somebody at the back. Okay.
So I saw you redeploy the applications to get the translation active. Is that necessary?
Yes, so if you want to actually get the translations into production, like not just in the preview deployment, currently you need to, the idea is that you download them back into your version control, build a new production version, and then redeploy that. We are also considering that it would also be possible for even a production application to read the translations directly from Control Center, so that you could just bypass that step entirely. which would mean that you could actually make live changes to your translations in a production deployed application. So the question is whether people want to do that. So far, we have kind of received a bit mixed signals about that, whether that's something people want. Regardless, of course, you probably want to, at some point, get those translations back into your version control. So it's something that we are very eager to get feedback on. In general, this is the very first version of a completely new feature in a new product, Control Center and Copilot. And so we're super eager to get feedback, ideas about features that you would like to see, ways in which these features could work for you. So please get in touch if you have any such feedback. I think there were still some questions at the back. Same question, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions before we move to 15-minute break? Rolf, thank you.
Thank you.